What did the Senate Intelligence Committee respond to you?
Well, a lot of that discussion was classified. My takeaway from it is that the oversight mechanisms in place are not sufficient.
But before we get to the conclusion,
okay.
you provided, when I was writing a story about you, some letters that you'd gotten back.
Oh,
what did the Senate Intelligence Committee's letters say?
Actually, so I only got letters from the House and the NSA. I didn't get one.
Senate didn't write back at all.
The Senate didn't write back at all.
Silence. House writes back and says, what?
Thank you for your concern. We've taken the action deemed appropriate.
The end.
The end.
NSA Inspector General writes back and says what?
Thank you for your concern. As you noted, you don't know the details of our minimization procedures.
That's not all they said. They said you have no evidence that we're targeting Americans abroad.
That's true, yeah.
Is that the issue, targeting?
No, that's not the issue.
Bulk collection, incidental collection is the issue.
Yes.
So the letter had nothing to do with what the problem is.
Correct.
And blew you off.
Yes.
So your conclusion is?
My conclusion is that everything I've seen, both inside and outside the government, suggests this is an extremely touchy issue. There's a huge amount of collection on U.S. persons. It's being shared with foreign governments. It's being shared with the FBI to prosecute Americans. In my view, it's totally outside the bounds of the Constitution. I mean, if you had gone to the founders of this country and said, it's okay if we collect every single communication of every single American and write our own rules for searching it at will to prosecute them, they would say that's not what we meant by the Fourth Amendment.
Let me turn to you, Marcy. So part of the Snowden revelation was that from 2004 to 2011, the FISA court was issuing secret orders permitting a bulk internet metadata collection program that was shut down in late 2011. And we didn't know about it until 2 years later because of the Snowden leaks. And you have written a lot about what you think happened as part of that transition and whether the narrative arc, there was a beginning, there was a middle, and then there was an end, is the right way of thinking about this. Can you briefly lay that out?
Sure. And this actually comes not just from the Snowden documents. It also comes from FOIA's for both Section 215 and pen register trap and trace documents that ODNI has released. So a lot of this comes from the official orders that went to the FISA court. And Charlie had said that in some ways 12333 rules are harder than FISA, but for metadata collection, that's not true. For metadata collection, the FISA court had imposed content. You can only go after it for counterterrorism purposes, had imposed pretty strict dissemination requirements. And in the case of internet metadata, because there's a problem. Internet, it's very hard, especially if you're collecting from the telecoms, which is what they did, to collect what is metadata to the telecoms. You're very quickly, if you get anything interesting, you're very quickly getting into what is content to the telecoms, although it might be metadata to, say, Google. And so when this program for the internet metadata was rolled out in 2004, the judge in that case, Colleen Kolar-Kotelly, imposed pretty strict rules about what categories you could collect. And at that point, they weren't getting everything. They were getting just from some circuits. But there were rules about what you could collect and what you could not collect. NSA violated those rules in the first 3 months of the program. Michael Hayden came out and said, there's no way we're collecting content. Paul Wolfowitz said, we didn't mean to do it. We didn't mean to do it. And then 2009, Judge Reggie Walton, starts to learn about problems in the phone dragnet program. And as he learns about those, he says to NSA, hey, why don't you check the internet metadata program as well? And so over the course of 2009, he works very closely, and this is often pointed to as one of the success stories of FISA reining in the NSA. In the internet metadata context, one of the things Walton did was say, give us an end-to-end report. Tell us exactly what's going on. Tell us all of the violations that you're finding, which were numerous that year. And give us your own report on how you're doing. And sometime around August or September of that year, the NSA submitted its end-to-end report. And they said, everything's great. Also, in the interim period from 2004, from the first violation until 2009, Judge Kotelly had said, you also need to do spot checks. Twice every 3 months, you need to go in and make sure you're actually only getting what I've told you you can get. So 25 spot checks have happened. 25 spot checks, this end-to-end report, everything's great. And then sometime just weeks later, I should also say that Judge Walton had also ordered the NSA's IG to do some kind of report, and that was in process. So just weeks later, NSA came back and said, oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe this, but every single record that we've collected over the last 5 years has had those categories that you told us we couldn't collect. Oh my gosh, we had no idea, which wasn't really credible. But at that point, DOJ agreed that they were going to shut down the collection of this Internet metadata program. And it was shut down from roughly October 30th, 2009 until July. It was reauthorized and took some time to come back off because it wasn't clear whether the government could legally collect something as metadata in the United States. And it took a lot of discussions back and forth to convince Judge Bates to turn it back on in July 2010. But what's really interesting about this is that moment in 2009, right before NSA says, oh my gosh, for 5 years we've been breaking the rules. They roll out a program, it's called SPCMA, but it's a set of special procedures to contact chain on Americans overseas. It was first sort of authorized 2007, 2008.
What is contact chaining?
Contact chaining is what they're doing with the metadata. They're saying, here's Anwar al-Awlaki. Let's find out who he's talking to, and let's find out who they're talking to. And they take all of those contacts, dump them into the NSA's pool, and do a lot more analysis on them.
So you're analyzing links between people to try to find hidden people of interest who have some indirect connection to a known suspect.
And that's the idea, is you want to find the people in the United States or overseas, which is what they're doing with all the 12.333 data. You want to find the people who might be terrorists or might be proliferators or might be drug cartel members. But again, in the United States, they're only allowed to use it for counterterrorism. Overseas, they're allowed to do this for pretty much any foreign intelligence purpose. So in July of 2009, like just before the NSA kind of confesses that for 5 years they've been violating the rules, they roll out a program where they do this contact chaining on Americans for NSA's largest group. So basically the Middle Eastern group, the ones targeting terrorists. That rolls out in July 2009.
The point is that they rolled it out for being allowed to use 12.333 collected data
to do precisely what
to
they're
do the
doing
same
in the US.
thing that they're having all these problems with complying with the rules for FISA collected data.
Right.
Before then, they could not use Americans' data under 12.333 rules for contact chaining.
But before then, they weren't accessing it from the same terminal entry. I mean, they legally could starting in 2008, but they just basically rolled it out. So the same place you'd go on your computer to contact chain on the PRTT, the domestic stuff, you could then say, I want to collect on the stuff overseas. So they just created the function so you could do it from the same desktop access to contact chain on Americans overseas. And then in January of 2011, they roll that function out to all the functions of NSA, at which point, for the first time, you're contact chaining on Americans overseas for purposes that isn't counterterrorism. That's any foreign intelligence purpose. So now there's the possibility, and again, this is just metadata, but you now have the possibility that Americans are, their relationships are being tracked for different purposes, for their relationship with Iran, for their relationships in Mexico, whether they're working with cartels. That's January 2011. At the end of 2011 is when NSA says, we're going to shut down the PRTT program. We don't need it anymore. And there's actually the
PRTT program is the FISA-based judge-overseen metadata program that they're having so many problems with, so many headaches with trying to comply with judicial rules.
Right.
So your conclusion is what?
Well, even in court filings, the government has said, we can't tell you about the old dead PRTT program because we're still using the technique. And they said, we're using the technique in two places. We're using it on 702 data, which is so they'll go to Google and say, give us the metadata. they'll get content and metadata from Google, but they said we're also using it under EO 12333. So they've said that they are using it under EO 12333. We know they have the authority to do
Well,
it.
they certainly use it with foreign data, but the implication is they're starting to use it for American data. And so your conclusion is that this program didn't end when it just escaped FISA oversight.
If this is in fact what happened, what happened was this was the part of Stellar Wind that was deemed the most problematic in 2004. So it was one of the first things they put under judicial review. They never managed, or at least for 5 years, didn't manage to do it legally, didn't manage to do it according to the rules of the judge. And then when it became too difficult to meet the rules of the judge, to meet the terms of FISA, they just took it overseas and took it to a place where there's far less oversight and where it can be used for far more purposes against Americans.
And the question is just how much data, purely domestic data, are they able to acquire under 12333? And this is what we still don't know.
Well, and I think John just told us some of that.
It's a lot, and they misrepresented the significance of ending the FISA program. So Keith Alexander, the former head of the NSA, came out and said, oh, we're ending this. This is great for privacy. We're doing this for civil liberties reasons, when in fact, they simply took it to a much less regulated system.
All right. Let me turn to Alex Joel. He's the Chief Civil Liberties and Privacy Officer at the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. And ODNI has been kind of at the fulcrum of responding to the Snowden leaks and organizing both a vast declassification regime. A lot of what we know about the problems with the Internet Metadata Program we don't know because of Snowden. We know because the government declassified it to its credit. And ODNI has also been at the center of interactions with Congress about what the security state basically can live with in terms of USA Freedom Act and what it's trying to resist. And Alex, you, after John wrote his op-ed in the Washington Post, and then the Times, we did our article on him and so forth, you wrote a fairly lengthy essay in Politico responding to the growing sort of concerns or focus on what are the implications for U.S. person data under 12333. It was called, I think, The Truth About Executive Order 12333. Can you sort of walk the audience through your rebuttal, or what it is that you think should be emphasized and what's real and what's not real here?
So thank you for that. I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's been very interesting. It's nice meeting you, John. And as I said in my op-ed piece, I commend you for going through the channels that you went through and for taking the care that you did with classified information. I think that's very important. I wish you had gotten more robust responses to your concerns when you raised them through the channels. And that's something that I think we should work on further, is that when someone does raise a concern, we take it very seriously. We make sure that that person has a full opportunity to express everything that's on their mind, and that we take the time to explain ourselves to that person. You know, you may or may not have agreed with whatever explanations would have been offered to you at that time, but at least I would hope that we would do that in the future for the next person who comes forward. So I won't go into detail in terms of the op-ed because it's out there for people to read. But
it's in your packet.
Generally speaking, you did a great job of summarizing Executive Order 12333 and FISA and how those two protections work. That was really my intent, was to try to better explain what Executive Order 12333 is. And the way you described it, it sounds to me like the description certainly portrays how I feel about it, which is that it is a regulated space. It's regulated with rules that are maybe different but comparable to the rules that we use for FISA collection. So in that sense, I would disagree with your characterization of it as being the Wild West. I know that that's just a metaphor.
From a separation of powers.
From a separation of powers. Well, from that perspective, we do brief Congress. Congress is aware. They fund, they authorize our activities. From my point of view, and I know that we've heard a very interesting perspective just before we came on here, but from my point of view, the oversight that Congress offers is very granular. I mean, they have professional staff, they have cleared facilities in the intelligence oversight committees. They take their duties very seriously. Whether or not the results of that oversight are ones that the people in this room agree with or other people around the nation agree with is a different matter. But from our perspective, it feels granular to us. So there are these two different regimes. There's the executive order regime, which is further implemented through Attorney General approved procedures. And as you mentioned, they're similar to some of the rules that we have in the FISA world. And you alluded to this as well, in order for us to target a U.S. person, an American, a lawful permanent resident, a U.S. corporation, or an association substantially composed of lawful permanent residents and American citizens, in order to target that person for surveillance, we have to get a court order under the FISA court.
But that doesn't mean in order to collect all their data, you need a court order, because you could do that incidentally under 12333.
Right. So, and that's right. So there is incidental. That's exactly what I was going to go to next. For the incidental collections, we do have rules, and as you pointed out, in order to, in some ways, they're more restrictive than in FISA. So for us to be able to query the data using a U.S. person identifier in the content world, we do need to get Attorney General approval based on probable cause that the person is an agent of a foreign power.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
Since, you know, one of the big topics in the surveillance reform area is the so-called backdoor search loophole for FISA Amendments Act collected surveillance. So when they have the huge storehouse of stuff they've collected without a warrant but in U.S. soil, then you can search through that stored stuff for other purposes. The FBI can search through it for criminal purposes, and you can search for an American's name or an account, and therefore I get private communications that otherwise would require a warrant. And so reformers like Senator Wyden have said we should require a warrant to search through that based on probable cause, and the FBI and the ODNI have strongly resisted that. Since you're already, it's just unworkable and cumbersome and so forth, since you're already basically doing that with 12333 storehouse information, why is it, isn't that a model that shows it can be done? Why is there so much resistance to adding that parallel structure on FISA information?
So this, I think as is alluded to here, the executive order permits broader scope of collection than you would be able to do under FISA. So as a result, you have more information that could involve incidental communications of Americans. So philosophically, everyone understands that in order to go into that, into a communication that's been collected under Executive Order 12333, to look for information about an American's communication, we have to be very careful about doing it because the aperture at the front end was larger. In our view, the aperture in the FISA world is very narrow. And so you've already made limitations in terms of what is that information that you're collecting, what the oversight and compliance rules are going to be to make sure that we do it properly, how we're going to make, report compliance incidents, as Marcy's pointed out, that those have resulted in when we report a compliance incident to the court, it takes it very seriously, and there are significant consequences for us.
So I understand this reasoning that the wider the aperture at the front end, the more restrictive the rules need to be on the back end. That's very logical to me. And part of this conversation is, are the rules right? Have we calibrated the restrictions at each level correctly?
Right.
And it seems to me that there's a huge piece of missing information in this public policy debate, which is how much U.S. person information by volume is being sucked in incidentally under 12333. And we don't know. We have people like John sort of raising hazy alarms, but he can't really say what he knows or what he just suspects or even tell us the difference between those two because he'll get prosecuted if he does. And so the answer seems to be, it's, maybe the government, the NSA, should do a study of what it has and come up with some kind of representative sampling, and so that we could have some data, so we know. We looked at 100,000 records, and 10 of them were U.S. person communications, or 50,000 of them were. Why has there been such resistance to providing an answer to that kind of a question?
So that's a very important point. We're trying to pursue finding ways to answer that question, both internally so that we know ourselves, and then externally in terms of how we can describe that to the American people. The Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, I see a couple of the staffers here, and they're going to be, Sharon will be on the panel this afternoon and can describe it in more detail, but they, in their Section 702 report, have made a recommendation to the NSA to do exactly that kind of feasibility study with respect to Section 702 data. And then for Executive Order 12333, I won't predict where the board is going to come out on that, of course, but they're undertaking a similar examination of what we do under Executive Order 12333, and I imagine that kind of question will come out. I can just tell you that in my personal experience, it is by no means every American's data that is being captured. But by no stretch of the imagination is that happening. In fact, it's a very small fraction of the internet data. Now, how can we demonstrate that? How can we measure that? How can we show that? In terms of the total amount captured is only a small fraction of what goes around the internet. So, can I give you numbers on that? How do we determine whether a communication involves a U.S. person to begin with? I mean, people use American providers. You can't assume that anybody who uses an American provider is an American, because often they're not. How do you know that this person's email address relates to an American? It would in some ways involve a lot of, in my view, problematically intrusive effort to actually dive into the communications. Now, could we do it in terms of a sample? Are there ways to study that? I think that was a very good recommendation that the Peace Club made. I know others on Congress have been calling for similar things. So hopefully we'll be able to make some progress in that area.
There's something you said here, though, that's disingenuous, which is, yes, the total fraction of global internet data that the NSA collects is relatively small, but most of the global internet data is like YouTube videos and Netflix streaming, which the NSA is not targeting, right? That makes up, actually, in terms of bits of data on the internet, like 80% of the bits, right? So it's only like 15% of global internet traffic that's actually communications traffic. And of that,
It's a higher percentage.
it's a far higher percentage. It's probably a majority.
I have to go back and look at the numbers. I would be shocked if it was that high.
Oh, well, so your takeaway is this is a regulated, rule-based environment, even if it's not from the other two branches of government, and the alarm sounded has been exaggerated from your vantage point in terms of everyone's communications are sitting in the storehouse waiting to be routed through.
Those are your words, not mine, but yeah, generally speaking, yes. I mean, I understand that people are concerned, and I understand that technology has changed. There's a lot flowing through the internet. Another thing that Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board has asked us to take another look at is whether we need to update how these procedures work in light of new technologies. Other people have made that same point. So yes, I think we have to take into account how the world has changed to make sure that when we go out there and do things, we're doing things with appropriate care. I don't want to forget to also raise an additional point, which is Presidential Policy Directive 28. That was issued in January, and it calls on us to change in other ways how we deal with signals intelligence activities in the global stage. And so we are working very hard to implement those procedures. In there are limitations on bulk SIGINT in terms of identifying 6 purposes for which that bulk SIGINT can be used.
Those are pretty broad purposes that you would concede, right?
Isn't it true that,
But there are 6.
Right, but in the United States, there's one bulk purpose for the phone dragnet, which is counterterrorism, and under that, you can at least aspire to get all the phone records in the United States. So if you have 6 purposes, you pretty much have a purpose for any geography in the globe. It may not be terrorism in Latin America, but it's going to be counter-narcotics. And once you have that bulk argument, you can collect it all, because that's what bulk is.
Well, it's a question of what you can
use it for, right? So you can't use it except for those 6 purposes that are articulated in there.
And the one that the government keeps stressing is we're not using it for corporate espionage to benefit private sector companies.
Correct. Can I just make one
yes.
last? I mean, you may be getting around to this, but Marcy reminded me that as you know, the administration and the ODNI and the intelligence community supports the USA Freedom Act and the passage of the USA Freedom Act. And that would change how the bulk authorities are being used, and so that.
All right. So this, you mean we.